All right, let's go ahead and get started. Next up here in Ballroom A is Jared Phipps. He is a sales engineer with SentinelOne, and he is an airman. He has worked for MITRE, also supporting the Air Force, and I think we're going to learn some interesting lessons from him today. So please give it up for Jared Phipps.
Awesome, thanks. Thanks. So like I said, I'm with SentinelOne, and we have a pretty good research team. Unfortunately, that research team is in Tel Aviv, so I'm kind of like your interface to the research team, right? So if the OS is over there, I'm your GUI. So apologize for that up front. No, so I kind of want to start off maybe setting some expectations for what we're doing here. I didn't want this to be a let's reverse engineer Meltdown and let's spend a ton of time talking about Meltdown. I'm going to go through some of the concepts of it, but I spent a long time, like I said, in the Air Force, security architect in the Air Force, did a lot of buying and did some different security operations there. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of give you guys an insight into what it's like from a vendor perspective responding to these things, right? Because I certainly had my perception of what vendors went through, and it's a little different actually being in the vendor seat and coming through with this. So that's kind of what I wanted to get through today, and so hopefully we're able to get that done. So in terms of like the flow of this, right, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of SentinelOne, not a sales pitch, and I'm not giving you the sales pitch side, but I want you to understand what we do so you can understand the context of why we cared about the Meltdown, and then we'll jump into some of the memory side channel attacks, high-level stuff, right? I'm not trying to go deep down, but we need to set the building blocks for how Meltdown worked and then go into actually Meltdown and then kind of hit our response and how we reacted to that. So SentinelOne is one of about 5 billion companies, it seems like, that's in the endpoint protection space, right? And there's a lot of people there. And the way I describe the endpoint protection space is historically you had a lot of static analysis that occurred, right? If you think back to legacy AV, I remember back when I first started, everything was a file. You had a signature hash for it. You could just crawl around your network, unplug your cables, run a cleaner utility, plug them back in. Life was good, right? But in recent years, things have kind of evolved in that space. You get a lot more live attack, direct attack, fileless type attacks, and so we've moved into, say, next-gen endpoint protection spaces. So you have a lot of companies that are innovating in the endpoint protection static space where they're bringing in artificial intelligence into static analysis. They still have traditional static analysis methodologies, and then you have this sort of post-event EDR space, right? So that's what I would call the automated EDR. And SentinelOne, we have a concept of, all right, let's call static analysis before pre-execution, and we'll call the EDR the after, right? So that execution's already happened. But where we really care and where we spend a lot of our time is in this middle segment, which is kind of unique for us, right? We want to run at runtime, so execution phase, right? Let things happen, watch how they behave, and then kill them based on behavior. So with that, if you come into a Sentinel product, and this is the screenshot, you're going to see there's a lot of different engines, detection engines that I can turn off and turn on there. So DFI, for example, I'd equate that to a traditional static engine, right? If I'm looking on this very left column here, I'd call that deep file inspection, traditional static engine, and right before that I have a suspicious, so that'd be my artificial intelligence powered side of a static engine. But then I have these behavioral engines, and there's a series of behavioral engines that we can look at. So behind all these engines, we have a security research team. And that security research team, we have researchers in Mountain View, but a good chunk of them happen to be in Tel Aviv. For the Linux Meltdown research project, that project was actually led by Dor Denker and Ron Ben, both of them out of the Tel Aviv office, hence me being here today instead of them. So I'll try to do them justice, but they did a lot of really good work. So a research team, they have a constant cadence of research projects and events that they're doing, right? There's just a constant cadence of noise, of new exploits, of new vulnerabilities coming out. When a bigger one like Meltdown comes out, then maybe that's multiple research projects across different OS teams and things like that. So for this one, I'm going to focus on the efforts of the Linux research team specified to the Meltdown, and keep again, right, that this would not be indicative of the total response. Kind of I'm come back to here, where there's multiple engines, there's multiple teams, multiple people evaluating. So we're just going to focus on this one subset, this one snippet. Okay. So before we jump in and actually start talking about Blacksmith and Meltdown and all that stuff, we need to kind of set maybe the building blocks of Meltdown. And I have kids right now, so my whole world revolves around Pixar. And every weekend apparently is spent at a theater watching Pixar's latest release. This one I actually liked. You can probably imagine this was going on at some point in time in the background while I was making this presentation. I thought, hey, that would be a great one to use. So if anybody's seen Zootopia, anybody here seen Zootopia? Okay, so I'm not the only one with kids or grandkids in here, right? All right, so that works well. All right, so I equate the rabbit to a CPU, right? So if you remember this scene, the rabbit gets introduced to the sloth at the DMV by the fox, right? And so the rabbit's like, how are you doing today? And the fox, or the sloth comes back, I am doing, and the rabbit jumps in, doing fine? I'm as well as, right? So it kind of came slow. So a couple things that this is sort of alluding to, right? Number one, memory's kind of slow. CPUs are really, really fast, and CPUs aren't necessarily patient enough to sit around and wait on memory. And number two, because they're not patient enough, they might do things called pre-execution. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. So maybe a more intermediate level look at memory. Dynamic memory, right, traditional memory, if you want to read that one block of memory, and sorry, the colors aren't contrasting as well as I thought they would. If you want to read that one block and you're reading straight from memory, that's a slower process, right? It takes some time. And of course, in the hardware vendor space, so your Intels, AMDs, and Qualcomms, all the chip manufacturers, they're really focused on speed. Because speed gives a better user performance, because none of us sitting in this room are patient, right? I open my laptop, I want it to be on immediately. I execute a program, I want the results immediately. So they're always pushing the limit to get better performance because people like us are demanding it from them, okay? So because of that, when you access something, and we'll saw this, cache is a faster place to go, right? Cache in the CPU, I can access that memory on demand. And so if you're the bunny, you want to deal with cache, you don't want to deal with sloths. So when you do read from memory, say I do a write access here and it's the first time, then they're going to go ahead and pull that value and you're going to store that value forward in cache. And so once you do that, all of your other operations should theoretically be able to go faster, especially if multiple processes are able to leverage that same value. At the heart, though, that creates part of the conflict. Now, the cache is protected, and there's privileges around that, and so you should not be able to directly access and read stuff from cache. So if we break it down a little bit more, and again, I'm still trying to keep these conceptual high level. I understand different chipset, different architectures, and Sandy Bridge and all these things have very specific models. This is abstracted still. But if I look at, say, processor cores across the top, and I could have 4-core, 8-core, multiple cores, and I could even have some virtual cores, but beneath that, they're going to have different cache levels. So my last level cache is typically something like an L3 cache, in some cases an L2 cache, and I'm trying to get down and get access to that last level cache. So we have this concept of side channel attacks. So side channel attacks are really enabled by that architectural design where the CPU is able to pull data in. Like I said before, that's protected. CPU shouldn't allow direct access to those values. But if you're smart, right, you go back to that t-shirt I was giving you, you can start to extrapolate information about what's sitting in there. And that's what side channel attacks are doing. And there's a large category of them. But the key is they don't respect privilege, right? You don't necessarily have to read directly from the memory, and I'll show you why. But they're able to get by some of those security enforcements around that cache. And since these types of attacks are based on circumventing hardware or architecture as much as they are in software. So if we look at a timing side channel attack, let's say that in protected memory space, I have a password and that password is secret. And I want to extrapolate what that password is. So I can make a request and say, does A match the password? And the computing system will look at that and it'll come back and say, well, no, you don't. And it came back pretty quick on that, right? And I keep going through the letters and no, until I get to S. And when I ask about S, the system comes in and it evaluates. And it says, well, here's S. Now moving down the next one, E, no, you don't match. S doesn't match SE, so it sends me back a no, but that no took a little bit longer. Okay. So as an attacker, if you're looking from a side channel on timing perspective, I now know that S is actually a good value, at least for the first step of that, because it took a little bit longer to get through. So then I can continue on. Okay, well, let's try SB, and let's try SC. And what happens now is this turns an attack vector into a linear attack vector instead of an exponential attack vector, which is problematic in and of itself. And so side channel attacks are actually pretty dangerous attacks. If you look at them, and you could do an entire presentation just on one different type of side channel attack, but if you look at them, we've been able to break cryptography and different types of things with this, right? So a very powerful mechanism. So ultimately, I'm going to break down, I'm going to get to secret, and I'm going to get the response back yes, right? So that gives me the information. So it goes back to my t-shirt coming up at the beginning of this, right? There's two types of attackers in the world, maybe, right? Those that can extrapolate and those that can't. So side channel attacks, kind of unique, kind of different. You don't have to read directly from the memory, but you can extrapolate what's in there, or directly from the cache, but you can extrapolate what's in there. So in the Meltdown, they actually used flush plus reload as their specific side channel attack method. Now there were others in the paper that they referenced that could be used, but since they used it, I think we've seen most of the POCs as well focus on that, so that's been kind of interesting. There's a long list of side channel attacks. And so theoretically, and if Meltdown wasn't already mitigated, you probably would see other people trying to use different types of them. But why they used the flush reload specifically, the authors cited two specific reasons. Number one is access to a specific memory line. Okay, so you actually could know where you're going at. You know the target and what you're trying to extrapolate for that information. And the second is that it focused on the lower level, the last level cache, right? So by getting to the last level cache, you're able to get closer to the user data. Great paper on that. I'm not going to go into the flush plus reload and all that stuff, but if you have the interest to it, this is a great paper to cite down and read through. They break it down pretty nice. So side channel cache attacks, that's one of the core ingredients of the Meltdown attack. Okay. The next one is this concept of speculative execution. Now again, I'm not a CPU architecture person, but I spent a lot of time writing code in undergrad, right? Decided I wasn't very good at it, and I'm now going to blame it all on out-of-order execution, right? So when we're writing code, we always imagine that the computer is going to take the code we write and it's going to execute it in sequence, right? Because that's how it originally started back in the day. But out-of-order execution has come about because we want to make CPU performance faster, and one of the aspects of out-of-order can be a speculative execution. So with this, right, you come up with all different types of algorithms that CPU manufacturers are building into the CPUs to allow faster out-of-order execution, which means that we can do execution of conditional events in code and execute every possible outcome or multiple branches of that outcome, so that when the condition is evaluated true or false, you already have the value to return to it. You're not waiting for that to process. So it's pre-processed, just waiting on demand, right? And there's a couple different types. These are the primary categories. You have static branch detection, dynamic branch prediction, and then adaptive. There are some neural predictor models coming out as well now. So there's another analogy that you could give to speculative execution to explain the concept, right? So let's say you're a speaker like me, and this may or may not be a true event, probably is, and you get this text from your wife saying, "Hey, did you make dinner yet?" Right? And I'm like, "Yeah, no. Remember that big conference I was getting ready to go to, and I'm working on that presentation for it." She's like, "Yeah, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. Make dinner." Right? And I'm like, "Yeah, I'll probably just pick something up instead. So what do you want?" So I'm posing the question to her, what she wants. And this is the kind of answer I'll usually get, right? Not Panda. I'm like, okay. Personally, I'm really devastated because I love Panda. But instead I'm telling her, okay, well, the kids will be sad, right? I'm not sad. Kids will be sad. So what do you want then, right? Chipotle or Panera, my usual at both. Right? So it's like, my wife is like the ultimate, I would say, conditional, never wants to give me a direct answer on things. So I think I've become, just through we just had our 17th anniversary, so I've become pretty good at pre-execution in 17 years, right? I just went and I bought both. She got home, they're sitting in front of her, she can pick the one that she truly wants that I couldn't figure out she wanted, and then the next one she can have the next day for lunch, right? So it worked out perfect. So there's my example of pre-execution and how that works. Now, if I was a computer, right, instead of putting it in the fridge, I would have just thrown it away. Okay. But if I was a computer, I also would have made like an exact clone copy of those and loaded them into, say, the microwave. I'll call it the cache, right? And they'd be sitting there waiting as well. And when I threw the food away, I would have left that one in the microwave. So that's kind of foreshadowing where I'm going with this. So the pre-execution turns out to be one of the crucial aspects of Meltdown. And before they got into, in the paper, and if you haven't read the Meltdown paper, highly recommend you do it, but before they get into the actual Meltdown vulnerability, they give a toy example. And this is the instruction block, how they illustrated the pre-execution sequence. So you have a series of instructions coming down a stack. And if one of those instructions tells you to do something illegal, right, there should be an exception handler that pops up, right? So in human world, if my wife tells me go rob a bank, my common sense pops up and says, yeah, bad idea, I don't want to go to jail, and I stop that action, right? I don't just do it. So here, right, if you're going through the exception handler, that should pop up, and that then executes the exception and stops the process. But under pre-execution, and this is what they really highlighted, is out of order execution or pre-execution, the memory values, right, were already pulled and stored. And so some of those values could be existing in that. So specifically, for the flush plus reload, like I said, they used it because it had high performance values and things like that. But this was actually, I thought, a really good visual of that side channel attack. You can see very clearly which value pops down, as that left column is the access time and which one had the lowest time. So everything else is sitting upwards of 400 cycles. This one's only taking 200 cycles to return that value. So it's pretty indicative that method worked. What that led to is the reality that you can now access data anywhere in memory. Right? So data now is everywhere. And if you're on a Linux system in particular, right, you could dump the entire volume of data of memory if you wanted to do that. Those of you that have ever done memory dumps, you probably don't want to do that, and this is about 503 kbits a second, right? So you're probably not going to dump everything, but that's where the flush plus reload comes in. It helps you segment and target that out. So if we look at this a different way, right? In memory, I probably have protected memory and user accessible memory, from user accessible being the process that I'm operating at. So what I need to do is, in my user space where I'm allowed to operate, is I need to make a request for an illegal operation. I want to try to access protected memory. I know that's going to throw an exception, and I can do that through exception handling a couple different ways. I can manage that, but I'm relying on pre-execution to reach out ahead of time and retrieve that value for me and load that. Okay. And to do that, you actually, and I'm just pulling this straight out of the paper, and you can see the paper yourselves, but to do that, this is the actual snippets of code that you need to execute, right? So this was the original Meltdown POC code that the authors released. So right after they released that, by the way, January 3rd, 5th? Dates are kind of buzzing in my head right now. But right after they released that, then some POCs started popping in. Paladin did one of the POCs, and I'm going to show you that one, assuming that my VMs are still cooperating. It's a live demo, so you know how demo gods are. Okay. So I have let's see if I can make this a little bigger, a little easier to see and read. Okay. Still kind of hard, right? Okay. So on this right window here, this is the POC loaded. And all I'm going to do is run and retrieve information directly from the memory. And so if I start to scroll through here, each iteration is retrieving a different value for me. So I can see that I'm running the build, right? If you can see this right here, right? Right here in the middle, VERSION. So there's the version. So this is the actual information that I'm able to extract out from the running memory that I should not be extracting out. And here's the Ubuntu build version. And it's on Linux version 4.10, right? So everything is here that I should not have. So the data everywhere, right? Everything I shouldn't have access to, I'm showing you here through that Pavlodin POC. Okay. Okay, so why did Sentinel-1 care about that? Well, one, we care about all the emerging threats when those type of things come out, right? That's kind of, as a vendor in the EPP space, we need to be able to provide protection to our customer base, and we have a constant, steady stream, like I said before, of research projects ongoing. So Meltdown comes out, that one's obviously much bigger. It stands out right away as unique because it's affecting architecture design. And so Dor Denker and Runben, as I talked before, they led the initial research on the Linux aspects of Meltdown. Now, they got the paper, they read the paper, and they looked at that, and they sat back and kind of like, all right, let's see what happens. POCs started to emerge, and there's a listing of just some of them. And so once the POCs were able to emerge, then they're able to go on GitHub, download those POCs, start to try them out. And this is an important step because the Meltdown paper comes out and explains the theory, but from a company's perspective, we want to watch how people implement that in practice, right? Because sometimes people use tricks or shortcuts, right? I mean, if I'm building a fence in my backyard, I'm not going to learn how to meld and build my own hammer, right? I'm going to go buy a hammer, grab one, and use it. So we want to find out how much are they going to reuse, how much are they going to innovate on their own, what type of techniques and what type of targets they're going to go after. At the same time, this is obviously an architecture chip design issue. We want to see what are those manufacturers going to do. How long is it going to take them to patch? Obviously, they've known about this for a lot longer than we have, so they probably have an answer already in play. So we don't start spinning up a whole bunch of actions immediately in terms of putting out the Blacksmith tool like we're talking about, kind of the free public available one. But we've got a lot of internal activity around this going on to make sure that we can keep our customer core safe. So when they start to grab those POCs as they emerge, they have a couple goals coming out of this as well. We don't want to write a utility that targets the POC, right? We're never focused on the implementation. If you remember back to those 3 columns I was saying, right? Static and behavioral and post-execution. On execution, on that behavioral piece, we want to stop the threat as a whole. So having multiple POCs and being able to learn the commonalities of the behavior of those POCs and how that behavior aligns to the potential behaviors explained in the Meltdown paper, that was really the goal there. So then once they realize that they have some things, right, they've got to get some tool sets to get in and monitor that behavior, and then also how are we going to write and stop side cache attack and different types of CPU level accesses, which isn't historically where we spend a lot of time. And so they decided to use perf events to evaluate the POC code. Now the question is, why use perf events versus anything else, right? And there's a lot of reasons to go into that. And this is where, say, the vendor choice comes into play, right? So things that I never really considered before, right? I just care about, give me the solution to make sure it works. But on our side, on the vendor side, we need to be able to, whatever we put out, it has to have broad operability. So I've got to be able to go across multiple chipsets. Although they're working the Linux piece, the company as a whole has to think bigger, right? So we've got to do multiple chipsets, multiple OSs. There is a lot of different Linux distributions out there that we are covering. So we've got to make sure we're covering all of those. And we also want to write as lightweight of a tool as possible. And typically you're going to see at Sentinel-1 that we want to use existing utilities as much as possible because we don't want to add overhead and processing overhead to a box. Clients get mad if you take more CPU cycles because a lot of their stuff is virtual, it's running in the cloud, and they pay per cycle, all right, or they pay per hour using it. So we decided, or I should say we, it's the researchers, I had nothing to do with it, but perf events was an event-oriented observation utility, actually a subsystem in the Linux kernel, and it's natively there under tools perf. Now there's perf events and there's the perf utility you can actually download compile, which relies on the perf event Windows subsystem, Linux subsystem. So there's that as well. You have the per task, per CPU, and per workload counters, right? So that's very advantageous when you're trying to get in, and again, we're focusing on the behavior as opposed to static signatures or, a static attack method. So you want to be able to track things like that, and this one also supported dynamic tracing at both the user and kernel level. So that's also a very interesting aspect of why we would use perf events. Dynamic tracing with kernel line tracing, right? Giving us insights that are really, really difficult, would take us a lot of time to try to write and extract those ourselves. And then obviously known and available, a lot of companies, are very comfortable running this type of thing. Okay, so malicious caching behavior and really malicious memory operations. So you're talking about the side channel attack vectors in place. Perf events is really, really big, and there's a lot of monitor events that you can extract from that, and they can be hardware events, CPU events, or just all types of different events that go into place there. So the team was able to focus on a few core categories: trace points, process creations, and then cache events. Things like L3 cache meshes. Now the thing is, these all occur in regular computing operations, right? And they occur with regularity. So it's how do you get to figure out what's bad and what's good when all these things are already occurring and these things are captured. But being able to come down a fingerprint into that malicious caching behavior or the memory operations, whatever you want to describe that as, the team specifically did not want to focus only on the lower level cache. While we thought L3 cache and like L3 cache miss events and things like that would be an advantageous way to look at it, we wanted to look holistically across the entire operation to see if, for example, the volume of requests that were coming through from a single process associated with Meltdown to be able to make that trigger. The other piece that jumped out was this notion of page faults. Now, page faults happen all the time as well, right? If you're trying to do an address which isn't current page, and they're very normal in operations. But if you filter out page faults and you apply some filters to them, then you can tell when someone's trying to read from the kernel memory structure, and that's not a normal operation, right? And so that gives you something to hone in on. So by using those primary methods, like I said, perf is a huge concept. There's a lot of stuff there. So by focusing on those areas, they were actually able to build behavioral fingerprints that they thought would apply to Meltdown. And then they're able to take that Meltdown and evaluate that against the current POCs that they had access to and validate that the fingerprint was working. So we're not fingerprinting the POC, fingerprinting the Meltdown behavior, and then using the existing POCs to verify, right, proof of concept that the detections would work against those POCs known that exist. But the real reason is we want to focus on the unknown future implementations of Meltdown in an aggressive manner, right? What if someone is able to figure out some sort of process injection and they're able to make a known process like Apache or something execute Meltdown on its behalf? We've got to be able to stop that. And we've got to be able to stop it the first time we've seen it, even though we've never seen it before. And that's where the behavioral aspect of this came in. So they did run that, and they were able to see that they had from a research, again, this is still a research project, so they could come back to the team and say, from a research project, we can detect all of the Linux Meltdown POCs using this type of behavioral fingerprint. So at the end of the day, Sentinel-1 ended up releasing that fingerprint, that specific fingerprint for Linux, as a utility, and they just put it out for the community as a whole. And that is what Blacksmith is. And so that's kind of where we go from here. Not typically what we do, right? We don't drop a public utility for every single research project that goes on. We'd be dropping dozens of those a day if we did that. So why did we do that for Blacksmith? Again, so in January, there was a lot of confusion. We get to look back now with a great amount of clarity around what was associated with Meltdown. But in January, things were a bit noisier, right? You saw articles like this, where the Linux Meltdown patch will get up to 800% overhead. So it probably wasn't 800%. It's probably typically around 3 to 5%, maybe 10% on high average, 2% would be your low. So not as dramatic as it initially sounded, but there was a lot of noise about that in the patch. And if you're looking at that from the consumer perspective, you can't just go out and replace all your chipsets. One, because you don't have them available, and two, that's really expensive. So the answer is either upgrade or patch, and sometimes that's just not an option, especially if you have concerns about the performance impact of those patches. So we thought, okay, well, in this specific case of Linux, we could provide this fingerprint, right? Let's wrap that into an actual product, okay? And let's make that utility freely available. And it has a very specific niche use, right, which is people that are running these Linux variants that don't want to patch, but do want to be able to monitor to make sure they don't have any active Meltdown compromises going against them. And then we can offer this out. And so that's what we did. A couple of headlines. I told you, like, back in that time frame, that the patch noise and the patch process and the chip design responses and the manufacturer responses. As a company, Sentinel-1, right, we don't want to get involved in that, but there was noise, right? There was noise of people like Linus, who are pretty well respected, kind of asking challenging questions of manufacturers and things of that nature. So we threw our noise into that mix and say, hey guys, you have something. Hopefully that helps stop this, right? Because this is what a lot of people seem to feel like they were going to, like, end of the world, because that Mentos and Coke are going to hit, and boom, it's all over. Like, computing is done from this point forward. So as a utility, Blacksmith is really straightforward. Download or run it as root on your Linux box. 2 operation modes. You run it with the -V if you want it verbose, meaning it's going to put back to standard out, or you can watch it on the screen, right? It'll give you the results of Blacksmith right there on the screen. Or you can do it with -S, which is probably how most people do it in operations, where you -S it and you drop it and you throw it onto syslog. And syslog can monitor that for you and then report in. So it's a very standard from operations perspective. Did it do prevention? Yeah, absolutely not. Okay. Why? I think that's probably self-explanatory, but we're not going to provide a free utility to go into a protection mode when we've only had a few POCs to test it against, right? We can put this out there. If people have false positives or concerns with it, we're sure we'll heal the noise back really quickly, but we don't want to hear about it going, hey, you crashed my entire AWS instance and I need this much money from you now because, you know, of this implied whatever. So we did not make it as a protection tool, only an alerting tool. So again, if I jump over to this system now, over here on the left side, and you probably saw this when I ran it the first time. Let me clear this out. So I have Blacksmith now running. I'm running in a verbose mode, so it'll come to standard out, but it's just sitting here watching at the command line. And so I can come into the same POC where I was running Meltdown prior, right? And we just run that again. And as this starts to run, the Sentinel-1 is just going to identify the process ID that's kicking off, right, that Meltdown attack. And so again, if you're in an organization, every attack can run under a separate process ID, so we're just going to log those out to standard out, or to syslog. You pick that up, then you can jump in, run your investigation, and now you have an option which says I can still run my Linux servers, but I don't have to necessarily have them patched and potentially crashing off of those patches. So, pretty straightforward in terms of conceptualizing and using this. So that utility is one takeaway. The Blacksmith utility is one takeaway from this whole Meltdown thing. But in the challenges and in the work that we did, there's actually some other takeaways that were pretty advantageous for us as well. So let me start. I should probably say perf events, right? So perf and perf events. Perf events being the subsystem for Linux. Perf in and of itself is pretty darn interesting. It's widely used for performance monitoring. Has anybody in here ever used perf? Mess with it much? Okay, not a whole lot. But it's probably the wrong type of conference, right? Because our community doesn't necessarily use it a lot. But if you go to, say, kernel or system performance communities, this has got a lot of buzz around it right now. As a result, though, it's changing really quickly. And by the way, Googling the term perf, it's not like other like IT or hacking or coding terms, right? This one doesn't really give you great results. So most people end up Googling for perf events. But the documentation, the community, it's hard to find a lot of stuff around that. So Door in particular was aggravated by some of that. And because it's such a vast library, there's so much you can monitor. Not everything you monitor will necessarily have security implications, but a lot of it will. And the other thing that's challenging is perf being as large as it is and being part of a subsystem in the kernel, it has different support by different chipsets. So in some cases, Intel and AMD will have different subcommands that can be run out of perf and they don't necessarily apply everywhere. So we had to figure out which ones are going to be able to be common across VMs, physical boxes, the different chipsets, the different OS variants that are going to be out there, which ones can we actually rely on. That actually took quite a bit of time. So it's about 2 or 3 week process to build, for this whole thing to happen between building and releasing this. Chip manufacturers are well aware of vulnerabilities before they're published. And that was part of the bounty program, and Intel paid out on the bounty program, so kudos to Intel for doing that. However, they have choice of who they disclose to and how they disclose to. And a lot of vendors, like in our case, we work to maintain relationships with those companies to get early notification. And so focusing on operating system developers and OS communities, that makes a lot of sense. Focusing on chipsets, I mean, we had some relationships there, but not necessarily the same that we have now after that event. I'll just put it that way. In terms of feedback of people who reached out and actually used Blacksmith as a utility, we didn't get a lot of feedback. You know, typically in something like this, you only give the vendor feedback when it's broken or it's wrong. Most of the feedback that came in to the research team was, hey, this POC bypasses your detection tool. Then they go and they open up the POC and they look at it, and they're using Spectre, not Meltdown, right? So, well, that's not what we really wrote it for. We wrote this one to target the Meltdown piece, not the Spectre piece. So that was the biggest thing. So they still haven't had the POC that's bypassed it, so we're still waiting. I'm sure it'll probably happen, right? I mean, that's kind of how this community should work. But after the mitigation factors got published a couple months later, I think the whole interest in this went down. However, that was still something out of this that was really, really valuable for us as a company that wouldn't even be apparent outside, which is in the process of building Blacksmith, Dorman Ben, they actually built a wrapper for the perf events. Like I said, finding the commonalities, finding which ones to use them, finding how to use them properly, using them successfully, that was quite a bit of effort. Blacksmith essentially was the POC of this perf events wrapper library. So this is what's actually been valuable for us to be able to figure out how to be able to reuse these types of CPU or core architectural level events and monitoring events to bring them into the behavioral aspects of all the other types of monitoring systems. And there are other monitoring systems, other monitoring utilities that we do and have used and light on perf before. So this gives us a whole new vector to look at perf. The second piece of that is this library will now enable more of a high-level programming language. If you haven't looked at perf, it's much more architectural, so a bit more difficult to leverage and write code quickly and efficiently on. This one will actually give developers on the Linux team a faster way to write these models, better leverage this across our product set as a core. So a completely unanticipated outcome for this, but probably the most valuable piece of all this is actually going to be that. So in prepping up for this, I did ask Dor, if you could do this all over again, what would you do differently? And his biggest thing was, I think we did most everything right. I probably would have started earlier, meaning waiting until all the POCs come in to try to start those modelings, have that stuff going earlier. The level of effort it took to delve in, basically understand how to leverage perf, that took a lot of time. And so we probably could have shaved a couple weeks off of the release of utility if they started on that earlier. But he was talking, so him and Ron Ben are roommates. They basically said that we took this kind of like into a startup mode. We just locked down, crashed down, went a couple days without even sleeping, just going away at it, hacking at it, putting this whole thing together, building this massive, this whole massive library and everything that they used to build Blacksmith. He said that part was a lot of fun. So apparently, if you want to work like crazy and you don't like sleep, then that's the kind of team to join. But that part he said he'd absolutely do again, and it was a lot of fun for him. So finally, of course, Meltdown, make sure credit's given where credit's due, and I'm going to take the screenshot approach versus retyping it all out because I find that easier. But quite a fascinating actual paper to read and a very unique, interesting approach, right? Leveraging an existing side channel attack methodology, but also going at it from a core architectural level on the CPUs was pretty fascinating, at least for me personally. So highly recommend, if you haven't read that paper, take some time and read it. In the meantime, that's my contact info. If anybody has questions or whatever, I can certainly Sorry, those.
Sorry. So now that you've provided this tool out there for people, and I assume customers are downloading it and leveraging it, have you had any feedback from a customer where they said, thank you for that tool, we had a security incident, and the attackers that leveraged Meltdown detected came out of the environment?
No, we haven't had that one yet. That's actually an interesting question. None that I know of. Maybe some has come in, but we just haven't heard of it. I think most of the people that did download, like you said, were our customer base, but we did also open it up. I mean, if you just Google SentinelOne Blacksmith, you can download the utility right now. It's widely available. So, like I said, the only time that we really get feedback on things is when stuff doesn't work as anticipated, and then they're saying, hey, I used this POC and it didn't work. And they were giving us the binaries, and we were able to look at those and come back and go, yeah, well, that POC was actually using Spectre, not Meltdown. So, yeah, great question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Looking at the new architecture for Intel and AMD and new processors that have come out, they still talk about these vulnerabilities that exist. What do you see as the next steps for completely eliminating this, either from a hardware or software perspective, today, tomorrow, a year from now?
So that's a loaded question for me as a vendor, because things I say could be interpreted as SentinelOne, right? And then SentinelOne relationship with chip manufacturers and things of that nature. But if you look at how they've released it, I think they've taken two different approaches. If you look at AMD and Intel, Intel wants the flag to be thrown, and then that's now a security feature in the chipset. And I'll let you Google and read the commentary from the community as to what they think about that. I'm going to be careful answering that just because of the relationships, right? But like I said, the Perfect Wrapper library that we put in place is going to help us continually monitor closer what's happening on architectural level attacks. And I think we'll probably see more architectural attacks continue in the future. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So, hey Marcus, you want to stand up real quick? We have these really cool shirts that are available right outside. He didn't know I was going to do this, but he has no choice if I'm standing up here, right? So I'll pay for this later. So right outside the door, we have these cool shirts. If you guys want some, stop on by, grab them. I'll be over at the table as well if you want to ask any other questions you want to ask in the group. But thank you very much for your time, and super impressed with ShowMeCon, guys. Great event.